what might be interesting for you, as you were asking for differences and similarities, is that Italian colonialism, at least at that stage, looked at colonial expansion from the perspective of, let's say, solving internal demographic problems and unemployment problems. So the colonies were a sort of outlet where to send poor peasants, mainly from southern and from some areas of northern Italy. And so in order to compensate this dramatic hemorrhage of Italians migrating to the United States, Argentina, and other, Australia also. So it has a kind of different approach. Then, of course, it evolved. Therefore, the idea was originally to make of Eritrea a colony of settlers. Then, of course, the situation changed a lot. I put here a mention to the fact that Eritrea very quickly became a sort of reservoir of labor for military purposes, mainly colonial troops. I'm emphasizing this because in both texts, which I'm going to discuss in a few minutes, the issue of the war, on the involvement of Eritrean in the war emerged. And colonial warfare has somehow also shaped a lot the social and cultural history of Eritrea, in the sense that a lot of male Eritreans were involved in the war, and as a consequence they became, I mean not in the war, in the colonial army. They were not all necessarily involved in the conflict. So they were instrumental for the Italian expansion in North Africa, in Libya, in Somalia, and eventually in Ethiopia. So it has an important role also in the sense that Askari, as they used to be called, those troops, also became a sort of social elite, and their kids were privileged access to colonial education and to colonial job opportunities. So there is a very strong connection between the military and the social in the Eritrean context. I mean, more than in other colonial contexts. Very quickly to enlarge the picture, the colonial expansion then moved southward to Somalia, and finally to Libya. They are all different contexts, different political landscapes, different strategies. We don't have time to discuss it here, but I'll just mention it. And a very important thing which I'd like to mention, because it has emerged during many different presentations, is that from my perspective, maybe my colleagues here can also endorse this statement. I have the feeling that we still struggle with a kind of narrow approach to the history of colonialism in Northeast Africa. I say narrow because it still tend to read the colonial experience through, I mean, within the nation-state framework. And by doing that, we tend to miss the connection, the exchange, the interaction within the colonial system. And of course, even worse, we don't really look at how a colonial system interact among themselves, how they study each other, how they mutually adopt models and strategies. The last slide, just to show you that eventually, but in a later period with regard to what I'm discussing here, in 1935, Italy invaded, under Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia, which led to a kind of merge of two former colonial territories, Eritrea and Somalia, with the newly acquired territory, Ethiopia, and that led to this new entity, which was called ambitiously the Italian Empire of Africa Orientale Italiano, Italian East Africa. And of course, in the ambition of Mussolini, that was expected to last for centuries, and it was advertised as the place where a new Italy would have developed. The idea that basically there would have been a further migration of peasants and settlers from Italy, and indirectly hinting to the idea that local population were expected to become more and more marginal within this picture. Okay, very quickly, why my title is writing War and Colonialism in Tigrinya. What is Tigrinya? Tigrinya is one of the languages. I can skip part of this section because thanks to the wonderful presentation by Chiffre, some of the major issues have been already discussed. Very quickly, I mentioned just that in Eritrea there are 9 ethno-linguistic, if you want to use this term, communities. Each of them has his own language, and Tigrinya is one of the Semitic languages spoken in Eritrea, and also in the northern Ethiopia, in Tigray region. The other Semitic language being Tigray in the Eritrean context. This is a very tricky issue, the issue of Tigrinya language, because then brings the notion of identity, because Tigrinya is spoken both in Eritrea and Ethiopia, so it is also a marker of identity in a very conflictual term, but we leave it eventually if you are interested for the QA session. What I'm interested in here is to mention the issue of directionality. Directionality is a term which I'm honest, I borrowed from translation studies, where it's used a lot on how the relationship of power, I would say, are established between languages. And what I found interesting is that in this literature, normally directionality in a colonial context is assumed to be a vertical directionality between colonial languages and local languages. In this case, I would expect it to be between Italian and Tigrinya. Now, what is interesting for me is that if you look at the reality on the ground, is absolutely false. Directionality are not, vertical directionality are not just established, of course, by the coming of a colonial rule, but pre-exist. So there is a hierarchy of languages. Somehow already Chiffre mentioned them when he was discussing the relevance of Girls first and Amharic later. So within this verticality, Tigrinya was not, in those years, was not considered a language worth of being written and being used for official purposes. Therefore, the fact that I'm quoting writers who used Tigrinya to write novels and poems has to be located in this complex linguistic power relation. The crucial actor in this process, some of the crucial actors in this process have been both Protestant and Catholic missionaries. Protestant were Swedish missionaries, and Catholic were, of course, Italian, though we have also French missionaries which operated there a few decades before the Italians. So they were crucial because they did an intense and systematic exercise in studying, organizing, and translating all major languages, I mean the majority of the languages spoken in Eritrea, of course for missionary purposes. And here is where the issue of verticality comes, of the directionality comes, because when translating the Bible into Tigrinya, they faced a very fierce and strong opposition from local Tigrinya speakers, priests and scholars, who challenge this by saying this Tigrinya is a language which can be used only in the market by thieves and by prostitutes. It's not a language we can use for spiritual issues. So there is this interesting dynamic. The two case studies which I'm discussing here are a poem by this writer, Sengal Workneh. The title is very, very kind of long and odd in English, How Because of Two Wild Beasts the World Was Set Alight, published in 1916. And the second is a novel which is by some scholars considered the first real novel in Tigrinya language, though the first book in Tigrinya language, as mentioned by Chiffre, was the travel book by Raza. This novel was, I put in 1950 because the author claimed that he wrote the book in 1927, but because of colonial rule was not able to publish it, so he published it only in 1950. But I will discuss it later. Just for your reference, the scholar who has mainly worked on this kind of literature from the point of view of course, of literary studies is Germaine Gashwi, who has published this book, A History of Tigrinya Literature in Eritrea, and I borrowed some of his analytical framework in my analysis. The first book, the first text which I mentioned, which I discussed, is this poem by Senghor Workneh. Very quickly, I'd like you to pay attention to his biography because it makes sense in order to understand the complexity of this colonial landscape. Senghor Workneh was born in 1880 in a small village, not in Eritrea, I mean in what will become colonial Eritrea, but in Tigray region, so a Tigrinya-speaking area, but in Ethiopia. He moved to Eritrea very young, and then he studied at the missionary school. Then the Italians sent him to Italy to continue his studies. In Italy, he joined the military. He got a training in cavalry, I think, if I'm not wrong, in Naples, and that is already important because normally in the literature you will find that there are no Africans in the Italian army except as askaris, which mean colonial troops, and nobody would be allowed, according to the existing regulation, into the cavalry, and which was a kind of elite corps. But apparently Senghor Workneh made it, and then he went back to Eritrea, where he worked as an interpreter in the colonial administration, to then go back to Italy, where he was recruited as a lecturer of Tigrinya and I think also Amharic language, if I'm not wrong, in the Istituto Orientale, or Oriental Institute in Naples, which was mentioned yesterday by James. A very important, the most important, I would say, at that time, center of so-called Oriental studies, but also the center where the the majority of the colonial administrators were trained. There is one detail. I just started. Okay, so give me 5 more. There is one detail which I'd like to mention. He obtained the Italian citizenship, which is something which normally you wouldn't find. So he became an Italian, and you will find in his poem that the poem basically is about the war, the violence, the devastation of the war. He described in very vivid details the civilian casualties, how many people were killed when by the German U-boat when they were crossing the Atlantic looking for job opportunities in the States. So it's a very vivid description, but somehow sympathetic, apparently sympathetic, of Italy and of Italian losses, and it expresses sort of apparently genuine pain for what the Italians are experiencing, and he attacked very strongly and very with very dramatic words Germany and Austria by saying that they are cruel and godless, and they do stuff which is unacceptable from the point of view of a human being. Very quickly, as I have little time, the second novel is the second text is a novel by Abagresus Hailu. Is a novel which chronologically comes later. He claimed having written it in 1927. It is about a previous event, the war of invasion. Sorry. The war of the Italian invasion of Libya. I consider it as part of the same chronological development from the point of view of war, because there is a new way of looking at periodization. So normal conventional periodization assumed that Italy went into war in 1915 until 1918, but more and more scholars, and I among them, suggest that if you look at outside the narrow European perspective of warfare, actually Italy started the war in Libya in 1911, and Libya was part of the Ottoman Empire. So the experience of World War I can be projected to a larger span of time. So the book is about this war, and the main character is a young Eritrean male, Tukwabo, who joins the colonial army. Very interesting, though the book is in a very strong critique, a scathing critique of Italian colonialism, the author stresses that the guy went into the army voluntarily. He was not recruited by force. And it is both a critique of colonial violence, colonial cruelty in Libya, but also a critique of Eritreans who, instead of joining arms with their brothers in Libya and fighting against colonialism, they are just a tool of colonial expansionism. So that is, in just few words, the main content of the novel. Incidentally, two things which the two texts share are the emphasis on travel, so the idea of travel as an experience, and the issue of modernity. The novel, for instance, spent words in describing the technology, like the torpedo. So he used the Italian term siluri, and then he put a footnote. You know, siluri is an instrument which works in this way, using Tigrinya warfare terminology. And Gabriel Jesus Hailu, in his book The Conscript, does the same, describing all the trip from Asmara to Massawa by train, then from Massawa to Libya through the Suez Canal by boat, describing what is a boat, how the boat works. So there is also kind of pedagogical idea behind it. Trying to make sense of all this, I had in my presentation, I wanted to point out two aspects. One aspect is the issue of influences, and just to tune somehow with the main theme of the workshop. So very briefly, in both authors are clearly, you can clearly notice influences from the traditional background. So in the poetry of Senghor Workeneh, you find a lot of structure of orality. That's why I like very much this oraliture terminology which was introduced yesterday. But at the same time, there are clearly influences of contemporary Italian poets which wrote on the war. And I mentioned here just a few of them: Carlo Emilio Gadda, Clemente Rebora, Delio Tessa, and even the British poet Siegfried Sassoon. They all describe the war in very similar terms. So that I'm not an expert in comparative literature, but I'm a poor historian, but I have the temptation to identify possibility of connection, influences, and interaction in both directions. Of course, I'm not saying just on one direction, but that is a mere hypothesis. In Abba Gabriel Jesus Hailu, the analysis is somehow easier because the text was published later. He could capitalize on previous literature in Amharic, which and also in Tigrinya, which was not the case of Senghor Workeneh. And also the broad anti-colonial narrative is somehow something which was much more common when he published the book in 1949, 1950. It would be very interesting, though we don't have time to discuss it now, to understand also the target of both texts. In other words, which audience were they trying to engage? And here we need to go back somehow to what I said at the very beginning, the issue of Tigrinya. There is a conventional narrative, even nowadays in Eritrean historiography, which focuses on the fact that Italians did not allow the Eritreans to achieve higher education, because the colonial regulation assumes that colonial subjects could go to school only up to the 5th grade, which is, in this case, a very impressive difference with regard to what I've heard here in the Indian case. So 5th grade or 4th grade was the maximum level of education accessible to a colonial subject. So the deduction by the inference that colonial Eritrean historiography has taken from that is that Eritreans were kept ignorant and their social and cultural emancipation was possible only after. That is again completely false, unsubstantiated, because both authors were writing in Tigrinya, which assumed, though in different level of intensity, the existence of a Tigrinya reading audience. And that is something which you can easily get from the introduction. Both texts clearly state the fact that they are writing for their fellow compatriots, Tigrinya speakers, with different perspective, of course. Senghar Workneh was just to enlarge the knowledge on the war, about the war among his compatriots, when Abba Gebreyesus want to point out to the violence and cruelty of colonialism. I'm going to the conclusion. So the issue of readership is interesting, and if you want, we can discuss it in the Q&A question session. Very quickly, conclusions. What can you get from all this, if it makes any sense? First of all, as I said at the beginning, the need to look at the colonial landscape as not a compact, monolithic one, but rather a fragmented, full of nuances, of internal differences. You have, in this case, an author which look at Italy in very sympathetic terms. He trying to defend Italy in the international arena. He got the Italian citizenship, and he died as an Italian citizen in 1929. On the other side, you have an equally educated Eritrean who had also important position in the Catholic hierarchy, who opted for a strong and consistent anti-colonial attitude within the same, I would say, environment. It's also important to look at the relevance and complexity of the subaltern agency and its ability to position itself within this fragmented landscape. And of course, as I said earlier on, at least in the Horn of African studies, area of studies, we should really struggle to get away from this trap, this cage of the national framework. Sorry for abusing other questions.
Thank you very much, Oldulu. It was very interesting, and I think these two presentations will arise a lot of questions and comments. We have half an hour, a bit less. Please. Yeah, sure.
I had a couple of questions for Vasudha. Vasudha, thank you for very interesting papers that had a paper that had resonances, of course, with, and I'm sure, perhaps every language in India, but I know the Bengali, so yes. I can say that there's a lot going on in that literary sphere as well. But that's not what I wanted to ask. 2 points. One was, you said in your introductory portion, before you began with the novels themselves, before independence, Anglo-Indians identified with the British. Just quickly nuance that a little bit, because of my work on Derozio and the Eurasian community in Calcutta, and the politics of that. He himself, of course, identifying as an Indian poet, insisting on being called an East Indian before the term Anglo-Indian. There's also a very interesting discussion of journal sort of publications where they discuss which term to use, Indo-Britain or Eurasian, or who prefers what, until, and the Anglo-Indian thing of course comes about towards the tree, but yes. There is a very strong feeling over there that Eurasians or Indo-Britons or whatever, East Indians as they were called in Calcutta, were a part of the Indian community and were separate from the British. So the identification with the British actually little later maybe.
Sure.
So
yeah, I'm talking about a much later period.
That. And the other is a thought that I'll just share with you. Very interesting description you gave of Sofia the fact that she's meant to be intellectual, again breaking the stereotype
Yeah.
in Bengal, certainly of Anglo-Indian women thinking of nothing but partying and dressing up and being quite vacant generally. The thought that I'll put to you, the figure that came to mind, is that of Sister Nivedita. And I was wondering, here you have a white woman, Margaret Noble, an Irish woman, who comes to India at exactly this period. So I was interested in the date. I think you said 1925, Rangbhumi. So this would coincide exactly with Nivedita's arrival in India, her setting up residence in Calcutta, and her whole persona, which of course also takes on this whole Hindu.
Yes.
I mean, via Vivekananda, she doesn't dress in Hindu clothes, but her entire thinking is, well, if not, she obviously also doesn't immerse herself in the river. But you know what I mean,
Yes.
that it's predicated. So I was wondering whether there's any resonance of that, whether there's any parallel that is,
There is,
consciously
no.
or unconsciously
Yes.
there in Premchand when he's thinking about a character like Sophia. Thank you.
Thank you. We will collect some more questions. Chiffre.
If there is. If there is any.
Thank you.
No, I had to.
With your permission, I would like to make a comment first. And then I will ask.
Sure.
The issue that Olelu raised about our insularity is very true, I mean. And one of the reasons why I'm so keen, if we, to organize this workshop next time in Addis Ababa, in my university, is because we'll have to encourage our young scholars to look out and compare their studies, their literature, their art with what is being done here. I mean, when Francesca earlier on was describing allegory, I had our famous writer of the 1920s, playwright of the 1920s, using allegory and Huru again doing allegory, and while she was doing the Indians, I was, my mind was bringing out the Ethiopian writers who used allegory very much, and in very similar ways, in some ways, the characters, etc. But as I also surveyed the literary studies, they didn't bring in, the tradition as developed, for instance, in India or elsewhere in other parts of Africa. So this is something we should follow, because we have this very strong insularity, and when we look out for comparison, we do it by looking into Northern Europe, where the tradition is very different, and then we conclude Europe is different, we are very special, exceptional.
True. Completely.
So, I'm very happy about this, and I really support Waldenur's position that we shouldn't always focus, use the nation state as our unit of analysis. We should break out of that. My question to Waldenur will now follow, and that is, you have this very interesting point about the resistance against the use of Tigrinya for religious literature, for spiritual, high-level spiritual literature. Is it documented? Do you have, have historians written on this, documented it? That's what I want to know. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Kumkum and Francesca as well, right? And James, and okay. And then we'll have the responses and back to you.
Well, a small question to Vasudha, which is between your two novels. I think what intervenes is Bombay cinema and the representation
No,
of
Bangla.
Anglo-Indians, so the painted lays, etc. I think I wondered where the detail, actually had a resonance with what was now visual category.
Yes.
The second is actually a kind of response to your idea that we should think outside the nation state much more. And I'm thinking actually that the history of Africa and West Asia. Sorry.
It doesn't work.
That the history of Africa and West Asia is actually a history of constant mergers and partitions. between existing countries. And I think this goes back a long way. So that, it's not just what you described as how Ethiopia comes into being and is then broken and remerged, but even look at South Africa. It was 3 different states which were merged into South Africa after the Anglo-Boer War at the beginning of the 20th century. So I'm actually thinking maybe we need another language here, which actually thinks about so many of these relationships as being, national/transnational. Or as I was discussing with in the morning with Karima, Morocco, half, Spanish colonization, half, French and so on. The second aspect, which I think is, I don't know, it's very contemporary, so maybe one is reading this a little bit ahistorically, is the whole connecting of constant war. You bring it to the fore because these are actually a poem and a novel about war. But if one thinks about, this from, the whole West Asian region, the past 20 years, such a resurgence of novels about war being written by women. And I'm wondering what is the relationship historically and now between, Pan-African and Pan-Arab. Because a lot of Arab feminists say that the Arab identity is a result of Islamophobia and, discrimination against a now historical region. And whereas Pan-Africanism actually had a different history. It had a actually much more idealistic kind of history. So I'm thinking, if one is wanting to think in parameters which are not only national, then maybe these two, and trying to figure this out might be quite interesting.
James, and one more question here. Francesca, sorry. I thought I had misunderstood.
Sorry, actually. I have one for each. One from Vasudha. I wonder if you can sort of articulate more what you think then this figure of the Christian seems more, well, I suppose even already this kind of seems to be merging of the Christian and Anglo-Indian together is doing, if they are actually socially two quite different categories. And I wonder, what work do you think it's doing in terms of providing, in a sense, the good English, the good anglicized who turns away from the too anglicized or too sort of English as social mobility of the mother and anti-Indianism of the mother. I was really struck by the, how free thinking can be positive in this context, which actually is quite striking. And of course the absorption into, can you be good only if you get assimilated or if you accept the superiority of Hinduism. I'm thinking of another novel of Vishwanath Renu in the 1950s, which also has it's an English woman who becomes the owner, inherits a zamindari in North Bihar, who becomes identifies with Radha and gets into a relationship with a local zamindar whom she worships as Krishna, and there's this continue. And it's almost like, okay, this is the good colonialism. This is a good colonial who, instead of being, pushing for racial separation and distance, wants to in fact merge with the Hindu kind of community. And for Waterloo, I was wondering, how does this play out, as you're saying, when Eritrea becomes part of Ethiopia? In a sense, these two positions or other positions, both having been, I suppose, more generally having been the colonial troops of invasion, but also in the case of the Conscript actually having been an early voice that said we should, in a sense, stop being that, and we should not fight for the colonial masters against our brethren. How does this play out after 1941, I suppose?
So, James, you wanted to?
Sort of simple question. Very interesting biography of Cyril here. He seems kind of, in some ways, typical of his generation, and in some other ways extremely exceptional. The profile of the mission-educated, multilingual functionary is common indeed throughout colonial Africa in this period, and yet the citizenship issue is so remarkable. I'm just wondering, do you know anything about how, what the consequences of this were for his life after the war and after the publication of this text?
I have a very simple question to ask him. One, the title of the novel is The Conscript, but at some point you did say that this person, the protagonist, actually joined the colonial army voluntarily. So there is just clarify a little bit. Okay, and I have another sort of, comment question, I don't know, probably a comment I would say, or sort of asking you to elaborate on this to Vasudha. You see, the figure of the Christian stroke Anglo-Indian woman, as the other visible, the other who's constantly juxtaposed to the ideal Hindu woman, it obviously occurs as a, very powerful figure across other language zones, certainly within India as well, and that can be. I'll just refer to part of my work. It's about this Odia writer, poet actually, called Kuntala Kumari Sabath, who was a Christian, a converted Christian, and whose life, what I am interested in is actually how these ideas are not merely literary ideas, they are also, impacting people's lives or experiences, or the manner in which they relate to nationalism or, community in a different way. Let me just describe this woman's life just to bring out this point, because she lived from 1900 to 1939. She's a doctor and very bright, and considered one of the earliest and one of the most important poets of her generation, and a very strident nationalist, very well-known speaker, and she's constantly invited to gatherings to encourage other, nationalist gatherings to inspire people to join the nationalist cause and so on. Now, but I'm more interested in this. Her biographer actually quotes a very long letter written to him privately, which is published later on, where she says that she later on converted to Hinduism through Arya Samaj. So she says that in my previous births, I dreamt that I was born in France, and I was a very promiscuous woman, and I did not value my husband, who was a loyal and a caring husband, but I was promiscuous and I was unfaithful and so on, and and I saw that I am dying of this terrible decaying disease and so on, and then while I am dying, I hear this heavenly voice which tells me, go and be born in India and learn the value of chastity. Okay, so in Odia it says satitva, which means the same thing. I think the closest translation is chastity. So and then she goes on to actually, in some ways, practice this. She sees she's constantly uncomfortable with her quote unquote Christianness, and she also is constantly seen as an object, a sexualized person, and it is said that she entered into kind of fictive relationships with her fellow nationalists, like somebody is her father, father, fictive father, or somebody is a brother, or mother. More importantly, mother. She's a very young woman, must be 25, 26. She died at 39, so when she was active, she must have been very young, but when she is in the public space, she cannot operate unless she is sort of,
Sorry, we need
in
to.
this kind of,
We need to.
she's in these tropes she has to have. So and later on, then of course she has to. Then she converts and she marries this Hindu person. She's still not accepted, in a larger sense within the community or so on. But this is what I'm trying to tell you is that how. What you see in these novels, these are extremely powerful ideas, and these actually impact people's lives or experiences as well, and or in some way determine the way in which they relate to. So in all her patriotic poems, which you cannot distinguish it from other kinds of revivalist poems of that kind, where she's constantly exhorting the men to go and fight, and are you sort of, if you do not fight, then we women will come out and we will show you, we the mothers of the great Aryan heroes of the past, will tell you, trying to shame, I'm just referring to Kumkum's idea of this rhetoric of incitement, which is constantly the refrain and so on. So there is a overt Hindu.
Sorry, we really need to.
Okay, sorry.
If you
I'm
could
sorry.
formulate
I
them.
think you got the gist of what I was trying to say. I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then, yeah. Well, okay. Can you make it really short, and then we'll give the floor to the presenters because we really need to finish.
Okay, it would be a short question but broad
Sure.
in scope. So sorry, apologies about that. So it's for Woldalul. Of course, you mentioned the need to look at colonialism in this nuanced and fragmented way. In Ethiopia, there is a big discussion on what colonialism means in the Ethiopian context. The Italian experience is dismissed as non-colonialism or not colonial, and there's an interpretation that the colonialism actually came from the highlands of Ethiopia towards the peripheries. So I was wondering, in the case of Eritrea, if there is a discussion about what the colonial means in that particular context. And of course, I know there are probably many answers to this. And I was wondering if you can talk us through the different interpretations, and particularly in relation to this, to Girmay's book on the history of Tigrinya literature. For him, the post-colonial has to do with Ethiopia. So for him, the post-colonial Tigrinya literature is the literature that writes back against Ethiopia. And you seem to paint a much broader picture. So I was wondering if you have any comments about that.
Oh, are we done?
Yeah.
Okay. So briefly, to Rosinka's. Of course, Rosinka, terminologies are vexed. What is Eurasian? What is Anglo-Indian? And so on. And at different periods, they've been classified differently. But at a certain stage, as I said, after 1911, it became Anglo-Indian for a certain set of people, never very sharply defined. And as for Sophia and Sister Nivedita, of course, you're spot on, because Premchand identified Sophia with Annie Besant. He said that she was Annie Besant. Though his biographer Amrit Rai says, what are the similarities? He just sees shadows, because Sophia is quite independent of Annie Besant as a figure and a biography as it is presented in the novel. Perhaps, as I see it, the love of Hinduism. This is something that they have in common. Kumkum, about the cinema. Of course it would have influenced someone like Dharamveer Bharti. He's writing in 1949, and by that time, of course, the Anglo-Indian woman has already appeared very much in Bombay cinema. But, the stereotype exists in literature also, very strongly, and also in British literature, and people have written about it. So one wouldn't be dependent on the other. They would coexist and perhaps color each other. Francesca, of course, there are two very social sections of society, Christian and Anglo-Indian. I felt that they came together for me because in these novels they're both treated as alien, you know, as not belonging and interchangeable. Sometimes they're just called Christian, as if that is their main characteristic and that it is what distinguishes them, quite apart from their manners and customs. And good Anglicization and bad Anglicization, in both cases, this was the surprise for me as I read the novels. Of course, there are ups and downs in the estimation, in the evaluation. Also, someone like Pammi in the second novel, who is more of a stereotype, but the stereotype is broken at various points, and that's what makes it so interesting. That they both have to bow to Hindu religion, custom, manners, and that a certain form of marriage is identified as Hindu, and another as Christian. So, that is a huge simplification, but that's what they work with. Pragati, I'm not sure what your question was.
I just want you to just reflect on
Yes,
it.
yes,
It wasn't
yes.
really a question.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, I said at the very beginning that I didn't want to be the obstacle between you and your lands. Then you asked me a question which required like 1 hour to answer them. So I don't know how we will make it. Very briefly, Chiffre, yes, there are documents, particularly in the Swedish missionary archives, on this debate. And actually there is a gentleman who has published Mengistu Alazar, who has published a book in Tigrinya and in Swedish, so not the most accessible language in this planet, on this debate. So, but there is a lot of evidences on this. I go with the shortest one, then I will focus on the other. James, yes, I agree. Is both striking and common at the same time. This kind of character. Which kind of consequences? I forgot to mention a very important thing during my presentation. Sengal Workner published this poem at his own expenses in Rome, and then he sent it to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in order to have it circulated in Eritrea, and they say no way, because it is interesting. That would require a long discussion, analysis also of the text, because apparently the text is a celebration of Italy and a scathing condemnation of Germany, Austria, even Turkey. Then there is also the religious issue. So Turkey being the Ottoman Empire being Muslim, so it's again playing for all these inhuman acts. Anyway, the colonial administration didn't like it, and there is a correspondence which I found in the Foreign Affairs in which they say we cannot make it circulate because it, at certain point, he mentioned some of the nicknames that were used against the Italian, like spaghetti eating and I don't know, mandolin players, but no real soldiers, no brave soldiers. So he says something: you use this stereotype, but you will see that Italy will defeat you. So paradoxically, this was considered as against the so-called race prestige, which was a founding principle of all colonial systems. My understanding is slightly different, because I think for the colonial administration was even less acceptable the fact that he unveiled the social stratification of the colonial society, of the Italian society. He mentioned repeatedly the fact that Germans are cruelly killing civilians who are just trying to cross the Atlantic to get a job, to make their endly meet. So I think that is more unacceptable. Anyway, it was not circulated, but it didn't have any serious consequences on him. He actually was asked to join, to go as a teacher in Addis Ababa, because there was a certain point in 22, I think, a project to open an Italian school. So they wanted him as a lecturer, but then the regulation assumes that he had to be an Orthodox Tawaddo. And he was apparently a Catholic, so I say, I'm not giving up my life in Italy and my religion to teach in Addis Abeba, so he refused, and then he died in 29 in Asmara, I think. So in Eritrea. That is, if I answer your question. Okay, so the conscript, very quickly, you are right. I use this term just because that is the title which they use for the translation, the Girmay Negash used for the translation, which was published, I think, 4 years ago, and that has heavy political meaning. They said he wanted to read it as somehow Sarah was hinting, in a kind of proto-nationalist, anti-colonial kind of foundation of the nation, and so he forced a little bit the title, which I wouldn't have translated in these terms. Okay, Francesca, yes, those two narratives, those two attitudes, of course, can be easily traced in the post-1941 development. To make it very, very short, you have an important section of the Eritrean intelligentsia which clearly opted for the hypothesis of joining Ethiopia, represented as the motherland, so we have to go back to where we belong to, and that is, we don't have time to discuss it here, but it would imply a very complex and nuanced discussion on elite formation. So you have a whole set of educated Eritreans who had fled Eritrea to escape from colonial oppression and to get also a chance for them to make some use of their education, who fled to Ethiopia and who became elite in Ethiopia. So some of them definitely endorsed this pro-unionist attitude, but also Eritreans and entrepreneurs supported within Eritrea this hypothesis. Those who had stronger connection, economic connection, career connection, educational connection with Italy, in some cases were also those who strongly endorsed this idea of national independence. So you can, I think, the issue of independence or union, independence for Ethiopia or union with Ethiopia can be read through many, lenses. One lens could be like conflict of elites which had contrasting interests. Some have tried to read it through religious lens, so the Muslim pushing for independence, the Christian, which is completely, I think, unreliable and unacceptable. So there are many possibilities, but I think I have to stop here with that, otherwise we will not have your lunch or your shopping. Okay, Sarah is conceptualization. Yes, what you say is true. Well, there is an interesting position. In Ethiopia, colonialism is denied. So colonialism never happened, didn't change anything in Ethiopia. We were all patriots, all resistant against Italy, which is, of course, it's not true. Then, in Eritrea, there is the opposite. Colonialism is a foundation. Colonialism is everywhere. It shaped us. It's what makes us different from Ethiopia. But then there is no conceptualization of colonialism. So everything from the Ottoman Empire to the Ethiopian is colonialism, which of course diluted the meaning of colonialism. So I would say in both cases there is no conceptualization. The Eritrean case I think is more interesting because there is an emphasis on colonialism, but nobody defined what colonialism is. And yeah, I think I can stop here with your question. It will require much more detailed analysis. To conclude with, I think there were more comments with those which you expressed. I completely agree on this important but also very difficult need of identifying a new language, new category, new lenses through which understand our histories, our past. With regard to the issue of Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism, to be honest, I've always been a little bit skeptical about those two paradigms because very often there seems to be more reflection of, particularly in contemporary days, of political construction rather than a reflection of a deeper analysis, particularly the case of Pan-Africanism, assume an idea of Africa as a unity, which is for me a very colonial somehow construction, paradoxically, and it pretends that we share everything, where we share something, but also we don't share a lot of things. So I don't know if it is would be the feasible alternative, but I think the challenge is there for all of us, a very important one. I hope I've answered.
Okay. Thank you both. Very interesting.
So, yes, lunch, and we come back at 2 o'clock. I think you can do the shopping after 4 o'clock. Where we also will go for a walk in Lodi Gardens for those who want to.
The point were made by Waldelu's wonderful presentations that we could just take up on those discussions and open them up comparatively across our regions. I mean, I didn't want to start.
Okay. So I have a couple of points here, and maybe then we can add to. So, I thought what we should probably reflect here. One was a bit more on our methodologies, and also I suppose Rosinka's point, even though she's not here now, about what had all this to do with world literature, I suppose. And I thought picking up some of the points that came up in the day, and then I very much like Nkrumah and Vasudha and others to join. One, I thought the coevalness of becoming modern, that was for really important. The idea, maybe, and I think something that came up today, modernity as technologies and all that, and instead the becoming modern, which suggests. Yes, a kind of a more, maybe, yes, allows us to break out of this belatedness and earliness and so on. Again, I really like the eruptions, the idea of that I thought was really, really good. I thought a lot of our conversations were around thematic points, whether it was thematic of genre even, but even thematic of satire or women's writing or war or the other. And I think we don't have to think of it only as thematic, as I was saying yesterday to Rosinka. I think we have to, if we think of it as thematic which takes particular forms and formal expressions, we started a really interesting conversation on orature, oral literature, mediators, technology, the relationship with print, but also the relationship that jumps over print to theater, radio, cinema, and so on. For me, it's important, but I don't know what you think about this idea of, often we think about literature and colonialism, we focus so much on ideas, on the new ideas and the new reformulation of ideas of literature, history, community, and so on, and we forget about the tastes. And for me, instead, keeping ideas and tastes in, and then maybe the biographies are also, a useful method. Then we see that often the same person will express certain ideas and then practice quite different tastes, and I think that's exactly one of the key paradoxes of in this period. The linguistic directionality, again to pick up something Waldelou said today, vertical as being not just between colonial and local languages, but also between different local languages, I thought was really interesting. And I wonder whether we want to pick up a little bit more also on the methodology of biographies, thinking about James's paper and Chiffre's paper and Waldelou's paper, the idea of Pragati's point about the Christian woman who, it's in literature, but actually she's living those ideas. I wonder
whether there are other ways in which we can think of biographies as useful, or biographer trajectories as useful ground for comparison. Stop.
Rosinka isn't here, but her kind of summary dismissal of colonial modernity worries me a little, simply because I think the idea has been coming back in one form or another, and I think at least I would want to put up something of a fight for retaining the idea of colonial modernity. But I think an idea that came up right at the end in the last paper, I think, on the fragmentedness of the colonial landscape, and I think it's important to pick up on that, on on how do we make sense both of the fragmentedness but of the landscape as a landscape, so that I think it provides a kind of framework within which one can begin to make sense of the play of similarity and difference across these, because merely to have similarity and difference obviously is not sufficient, because then one, obviously in all the local geographies one can assemble just so stories about why something is the way it is, and obviously that just so story is internally consistent, but it yields nothing to some larger totality that I am also hesitant about thinking of that larger totality as the world. So I don't know whether it's too early to get to the world, but I think that this kind of exercise is straining towards some translocal framework of understanding, and to my mind, kind of colonial modernity was the shorthand for thinking about this sort of translocal landscape. Though once again, something that I picked up from the last paper, which is, are we in some sense, you spoke about how post-colonial theory was trapped within the nation-state framework, and that the nation-state framework was inadequate to address the complexity of experiences in cultural regions, and that in doing post-colonial stuff, one was remaining trapped within the nation-state framework. So, is it something? Are we something like a post-colonial theory? So which retains the notion of the significance of the experience of colonialism, even as it is differentiated in local geography, in local context, and local conjunctures. But something like that might be called for. Anyway.
Francesca is looking very meaningfully at me.
So am I.
No, I think actually it's like we cannot set up a totality.
Yes.
Because even where we have it, we can't deal with it. As was my point about capitalism. And at the same time, all of these terms like modernity and the nation form are actually underwritten by capitalism. Neither would have come into existence without it. And yet, capitalism is from its inception transnational. It was never contained within the parameters of a particular nation state. So, my sense of it is that maybe we want to think about, if we want to think at all about the world, is to think about particular transnational constellations which provide, forms of entry, which may be, symptomatic but cannot be totalizing, which are very different but are also very singular, meaning unique, to their own context, as well as in relationship, to the others. So I'm not using the word similarity and difference, but I do think that one can think about, what does seem similar, but is never the same. So it's somewhat
Similar but not same.
Yeah, but not the same. So there is a singularity. So, and that allows me at least to think about each particular literary act, which for me also includes the non-literary, conventional terms, as being quite special, and at the same time as something that can be connected, to others. And here I'm also very interested in this idea of, I think it was Sarah who raised it, autonomy. How does one think about the autonomy of culture? So does being special and unique mean that it's autonomous? Or is it simply that, it is determined by so many different factors that it becomes unique? So that no two things can be determined, in precisely the same way. So in that sense, I think that if we want to think about, I would be hesitant to think about autonomy in a anti-historicist fashion, which I think Rosinka was doing. She was seeing the change as coming from within literature, whereas I actually think that literature itself was such an open category in the 1850s, that where was this within from which the change happened? So I would sort of stick to very much more historical readings, in that sense, because then I think you see the connection at both levels, in terms of particular, historical moments. And these can be vastly separate, like something that happens in one colonized country in the early 19th century might be happening in the early 20th in another. And I think this is very much the case with Africa. From all the talks I've heard, it was wonderful to learn from them, is that in a sense the colonization of Africa is internally varied. It takes place much later than India, much later. Some of it takes place with horrifying violence, and some of it seems to take place by bureaucratic drawing of borders and remaking nations. And so that the fact that certain things that are happening in Ethiopia might be happening much earlier in India. And I think that in itself is very interesting, that becoming modern is not limited to a particular 2 or 3 decades, that it's a question of, the way colonial capital spreads, that you get, the unevennesses, the time gaps, the seeming belatedness. So it becomes a way of reading more widely, beyond one country. To think that belatedness and time gaps and time lags are actually inherent in colonial capitalism. They're not, and its political manifestations. After all, the British finished annexing India by the middle of the 19th century with the annexation of Punjab. And whereas the most volatile period of conquest in Africa is after that. So I'm thinking, and also we want to think about the difference between more superficial and less aggressive colonization. As seems to be the case with Spanish in Morocco, from what I learned from Karima, as opposed to the Belgian in Congo, right? And the difference between distance colonization, like the British in India, and settler colonialisms, like South Africa, Canada, and New Zealand, and so on. So I think that might help to also think about, this play of what Alok is calling difference and sameness. Sure, please.
Yeah, if I can add, because maybe I was not articulate enough in my presentation. When I say that it's important from my point of view to escape from the trap of the nation state as an analytical framework, I thought, I had this idea from two, different but at the same time interrelated epistemological perspective. One is just from the point of view of historiographic methodology. So how do you, deconstruct some categories and how you make sense of discrepancies and change, and you reject the shortcut and you get into complexity and try to understand the different articulation of the colonial society. But then I have a second concern, which is more, if you want to say, can say, more practical, in the sense, which is also political, if you want. And my understanding is that a lot of those narratives, which we consider basically as colonial narratives, are still alive and playing us and affecting our life at many levels. The first, of course, is the national again, the national framework. Eritrea and Ethiopia is the best case. I mean, Eritrea and Ethiopia fought 30 years. We lost so many of our, families and whatever, to fight for something which is a model which historically doesn't make sense, because Eritrea is not a nation state. It is a patchwork of 9 different nationalities. And from my point of view, also Ethiopia, though it has a much more complex political history. So we have a fight for a model which doesn't make sense in the political history of this territory. It is more a readaptation, re-elaboration of a political model which is a colonial one in a different landscape. So that is very, very something very practical from my point of view. I mean, it still affects our lives. But the examples could be many. I've been interested for a while in urban history. So the way more or less all colonial urban planners organized the towns was along both functional and racial lines. So normally you have this colonial center, which is wonderful, well organized, with plenty of air, and very exactly, and with very specific parameters for windows and fresh air and lights. And then you have the indigenous district, which is packed and crowded and dirty and unhealthy, and that is more or less universal. So the problem is that decolonization didn't make the decolonization also of the urban space. The urban space remained colonized, but now instead of racial lines, you have social lines. So in the African case, the black elite moved where the white were, but the black poor remained where they were, which is something which is again colonial in the sense we carry with us models of organization of the urban space, which is basically a direct production of colonialism. Not because there was not injustice before or unequal social relation, but the modern notion of urban space in which all of us live is a colonial inherited one. So those are the two kinds of concern behind my idea of breaking this national pattern.
Thank you. Just to reflect, for me, what was very striking is the idea of cultural politics and the way they're very much interlinked with languages. And I find it fascinating that, and the way, in a way, they break down the binaries, whether there are religious, the colonized authenticity, colonial alienation, and how they open up spaces for wider geographies, wider intellectual and linguistic geographies of interaction, of somehow like a traffic of ideas and influences that I find very pertinent to the case of the Maghreb, that goes beyond the framework of the nation state or a particular language and how it's perceived in a particular region. And I think that has, in a sense, showed or demonstrated a particular agency that is shaped and being shaped by its own shaping, and also it has been shaped by its own time and context, because I think historicity is extremely important. But it was an eye-opener for me to read about the Maghrebis and the way, for example, the Moroccans have been so isolated throughout the history, during particularly the 19th century and the Ottoman Empire, but the way they opened up to various regions, including Iberian Peninsula, and then the Mashrek, and then of course Europe, and how that has created a geography, in Francesca's famous word, a significant geography of influence that is not really a one-way, it's quite complex. And how following that kind of break down those barriers of nation, language, religion, ethnicity, community, which I think is quite powerful in the context I'm working on.
Sorry, just to push on your point. So would you say, and trying to link it with language, would you say again that there is a kind of, at the level of ideas and a level of policies, a kind of, and a level of also local elite, a kind of, in some cases, a desire for monolingualism or a kind of a production of monolingualism, even as an idea, if not as a practice. But then we also heard in other cases that there was a sort of was it Chiffre? Who was it talking about? Well, actually, it's colonialism that produces multilingualism. Was it in your case? Was it?
No, I think it was Kumkumwal when she talked. I think Kumkumwal talked about the arrival of the colonial language as a.
I think it was another paper, Sarah's paper. No, wasn't it that? Yes, your paper, Sarah, wasn't it? That was saying that actually it's colonialism that produces multilingual. That it cannot.
The imposed French.
So they were trying for French, but actually they cannot, and they have to go for.
Although they imposed monolingualism in other places, so again the ambiguity of colonial system and their ambivalence. I think we were talking to Etienne just earlier about how the elite.
The elite maintain their interest. In the case of the Maghreb, it was the ulama, the Arabophone ulama, and the way they wanted to maintain their own position of power, of course, to maintain the one language. But I think it was the arrival of foreign languages and another print culture has completely turned that upside down. And I think that's what I noticed. I was trying to say to you earlier that I was worried that I would be called a sympathizer of colonialism, because what I perceived in my readings of the Maghrebi writers who are the product of colonial education is that the encounter with the other culture has enabled a form of critique, which came from the bottom in a sense, which was critical of both the home culture and the foreigner, which I think is quite interesting in generating a particular kind of nahda that goes back well beyond history, that encounter, that allows the renewal of the self from that critical perspective.
Actually, this is what I wanted to briefly come in on, is this, Kilito's idea of the first nada. And I was thinking, it's very interesting. These are histories of long-term circulations, which are very pre-colonial. Because if you think of the fact that it was Arab philosophers who were the keepers of what later became European philosophy, because it was not at all clear that Greece belonged to Europe, but it was Europe which took on Greece and Rome as its forebears. So if you think of the fact that Arab philosophers were the keepers of European philosophy in translation, when it was destroyed in its own, in Europe itself, and that this circulation was what allowed the European Renaissance to come into being, was the discovery of this kept philosophy. Then in that sense, when Kilito talks about the first nada, he's actually talking about a form of openness which we falsely associate with the modern. This was a form which long pre-existed. I mean, you find it in Abul Fazal. He said we have to read wise men and take what we can from them, regardless of which country they are from. So I think this idea of openness as part of renewal has to therefore be seen as being reconstituted on colonial ground, but actually having a very rich history, before that.
I would say there are two types of interaction. One, as you said, that the long process of circulation of ideas precedes what we call modern colonialism. But this colonial interruption in what we later call national histories has done something. So I was thinking about, for example, Pandita Ramabai. So where does Ramabai find solidarity for what she is doing? And because the militant nationalist leaders of India are not supporting her, the other leaders were supporting her, and she finds support outside India for her work for widows and women in near Pune. Secondly, if you look at or read the testimony of Jyotiba Phule before Hunter Commission, and what he has to tell them that please don't put Atishudras in the schools which are manned by Brahmins. You have to have exclusive schools for them. Otherwise, these Brahmin teachers won't allow them to study. So his expectation is from colonial masters. So he is not very concerned about whether this colonialism is going to stay or not. And what later Sumit Chakravarti told us, that please don't look, as you suggested in your last paper, that don't look at everything happening in this boundary through nation-state lens or nation-state frame. So there are autonomous things happening simultaneously. So this Ramabai thing, or Jyotiba Phule, or the acceptance by writers like Premchand, what they are practicing, the genre which they are practicing, has been taken from the West, and they write it without any guilt. So this is something that they have received from the West, and they write very, very freely, and the free spirit with which they like about this interaction is something very interesting. Whether they are confronting, and again I am going back to my character Gandhi, because what he does, he is creating a geography in which he is attracting people from those areas which consider themselves to be modern and far ahead of those who have been colonized by them. But they are coming to this geography to get liberated. So they are becoming citizens or people of a territory which is not nation, but it's a liberatory zone, not only for India, but for them as well. So people from Poland, from Australia, from Austria, from England, from America and other areas are coming to India to participate in what's called the freedom struggle of India and be part of it. So what is doing to Indian languages, what is doing to our literatures, and our awareness of, for example, through Gandhi or through personalities like them, because Gokhale is visiting South Africa or Africa. So our awareness of the world around us was much more acute then, I would say, than it's now. We really don't know what's happening in Myanmar or Bangladesh or in Pakistan.
Sorry, I also thought, picking up on something that was coming up the previous days, I thought Uday's ideas of neighborhood was a really one that we could explore further, of which I suppose partly overlaps with mental map also, the idea of what is it that I know Sarah uses, of what you feel is close to you, whether it's geographically close to you or not, whether, I think as you put it, where you can intervene also, you can protest, intervene, and have a stake in. And the other one I think that came up again very, very strongly in Kumkum's talk was the and in Charu's talk as well, this and Chiffre, this comparison, this gesture of comparison, which I suppose again we're usually used to think about it only from the colonizer's point of view, that they come and compare and have the ladder and of civilization and so on. But it was interesting to see how the women travelers or the women polemicists are also using comparison in all kinds of other ways of I don't know, exposing, of yeah. Please.
मैम मेरा सवाल ये अंतिम वक्ता से है, और वो ये कि सर ने जिस तरह से अपनी चीज़ें बताई, कल और अभी के या फिर परसों की जो चीज़ें हमने सुनी उसके अंदर ये है कि औपनिवेशिक दौर में प्रहसन चल रहा है, हास्य व्यंग्य में चीज़ें चल रही हैं, किताबें लिखी जा रही हैं और वो छप भी रही हैं, यानी कि एक पाठक है हमारे पास जो पढ़ रहा है। इन सारी चीज़ों में कहीं ना कहीं वो सारी चीज़ें कही जा रही हैं जो आप जनता को के लिए कह रहे हैं ताकि वो जागें या फिर विरोध करें या संघर्ष करें, लेकिन ये सारे इनडायरेक्ट तरीके से हो रहे हैं, अप्रत्यक्ष तरीके से हो रहे हैं। आज सर ने एक किताब का नाम लिया जो 1927 में लिखी गई है और उसे छपने के लिए 1950 का इंतज़ार करना पड़ा। वो 13 साल का एक लंबा गैप है। तो उन किताबों को हमें किस तरह देखना चाहिए औपनिवेशिक दौर में, जो अपने पाठक से एक सीधा संवाद कर रहे हैं और जिनको बिना छापे ही प्रतिबंधित कर दिया जा रहा है। तो मैं सर से ये जानना चाहूँगी कि उस किताब के अंदर जो कंटेंट था वो किस तरह का था, क्यों उसको पहले ही बंद कर दिया गया, क्योंकि कल और आज में बहुत से ऐसे संपादकों के नाम आए जिनको बाद में प्रतिबंधित किया गया या उनके लिए नोटिस जारी किया गया। तो ऐसा क्या कंटेंट था जो कि पहले रोक दिया गया? दूसरा ये कि 13 साल एक लंबा समय है, उतने लंबे समय के अंदर वो एक लेखक किस तरह से स्ट्रगल कर रहा था उस किताब को छापने के लिए, अगर वो 1950 में छप पाया है तो, और 1950 में जब वो किताब छप गई है तो उसके क्या रिएक्शंस आए हैं हमारे पास। और इसी तरह से अलग अलग देशों में जो औपनिवेशिक दौर की वो किताबें हैं जिन्होंने छपने के लिए एक लंबा इंतज़ार किया है, उसे हम कंपैरेटिव स्टडीज़ में किस तरह देख सकते हैं, या फिर उसके लिए कोई नया औजार है या नहीं है हमारे पास?
So this is a question for you, Waldalu, which is to say, what was it in the conscript that Dipti Singh that did not allow it to even come before its readers. So not that it was published and then it was proscribed, but what was it that it took from 27 to 50 to actually before it was published? And was there a struggle of the writer to get it published?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have explained it during my presentation. What the author claims is that he wrote a book in 27 when he was crossing the Mediterranean to go to Italy for training, to be trained as a priest. He was a priest, Catholic priest. Then he said, I couldn't. He doesn't explain it, but it hints to the fact that he couldn't publish it because, of course, there was colonial rule, and his book was a very strong attack to colonial institution, colonial rule, and policies. So he said, I'm able to publish it only now in 1949, 1950, because the Italians are not there anymore, and I have the possibility to publish it. That is what he said. Then the question is how you, from the historical perspective, how you analyze it. And I was just discussing with Francesca during the break that my personal idea is that this book has two levels. One level is the one you get on the narrative, so the story of these young soldiers, so the critique of colonialism and the cruelty of the Italian rule, how unfair it was to the Libyans, and in general is a critique of colonialism. But then, as Gabriel Jesus Hailu was a supporter of the union between Eritrea and Ethiopia, so he was not supporting the idea of a separation between the two. My understanding is that maybe one of the real meaning of this book, the real audience of this book, were his fellow Eritreans, and it was a way of talking not about actually colonial rule, but talking about the present situation, which means you have to, okay, you didn't do that earlier when you had to fight the Italians, and instead you sided with them and you supported them in oppressing others. You shouldn't do the same mistake now, so you should join Ethiopia. That is my understanding of the target of this book.
thoughts about either any of this or methodologies or?
It's not quite well formed in my head also, but I'm just trying to articulate this. Looking at all the presentations and the different types of texts that that we are looking at, they belong to different genres. They belong to different things, different spaces they're coming from. But I was wondering, like, when you sit back and listen to this and observe this, I was wondering whether we are using the same tool to analyze, kind of forensic tool to analyze all the text, irrespective of the genre or space that they're coming from. I'm not very clear because because we are also 20-minute presentation, so we are not very clear whether how actually the researcher has gone about doing things. What comes to you is this 20-minute presentation, so it looks like there is a forensic endeavor in order to find out, investigate in a particular manner and reveal something. So there are revelatory experiences when you listen to each text, each presentation, there is something which is revealed. So all of us experience that revelation also. But I'm talking about, because you're talking about methodology, I'm wondering whether when you're thinking about methodology, and in a forum like this, where people are coming from different spaces, different experiences, and also dealing with different genres, whether we can think about methodology in a homogeneous manner, or and if we cannot, obviously we cannot, then how do you enter that space? What are the gateways? So is there a way to think about these gateways at all?
Well, to me, it goes again at the sort of a dynamic or between what Amir Mufti calls assimilation in the universal category of literature at this time, or the universal categories of genre, and of course think of the novel, think of the lyric, think of drama, and instead the fact that we don't want to, so we want to be cognizant of the fact that this is a phenomenon that is happening at this time, with all kinds of reactions as well. So saying, no, the novel, we had the novel before, we had, the short story from ever, we've always had the lyric, this is all part of the same gesture of assimilation, while at the same time we're saying, actually, literature, genres are not stable categories, and they're not universal in that way. So I think, we want to keep, hence the exploration of text and genres, without saying, okay, there is something called allegory, and we all know what it is, and now I'm going to tell you what this particular one is, but I want to, or satire. We all know what satire is. We had actually a student presentation the other day at SOAS which said, this is what the lyric is, and now I'm going to say what how the Somali lyric fits in it. And you say, well, clearly that may be a critical phenomenon that people want to do that, but clearly that is not what we want to do, while being cognizant of the fact that this is a critical gesture that is so prevalent again in this time. So, you do a literary history, then you have to have periodization. So then you spend a lot of time thinking, what are my periods? Possibly what are my 4 periods, or what are my 3 periods? So obviously then that, we want to take cognizance of the fact that this is something that clearly people get very invested in, but that it creates its own problems and complications and deviates from other possibilities.
At least that's my take.
Universal, Mufti talks about universal as European, assimilation by universal into European categories of knowledge about the natives, and that includes, of course, literature. I was thinking of something Kilutu said in one of his books, that Europe has managed to impose its genres, literary genre, on all the globe, on all levels, and then the question is how to find a different language to talk about
cultures of the South that is different from that language, and how you can make it viable, you know. And I think the idea of COMCOM, of looking for constellations, we actually applied for a grant called South-South Literary Constellation, so let's hope we get it. And so it looks about this idea of southern constellations, like what do we have here? Like Horn of Africa, Maghreb, and India as a constellation. In a sense, that it doesn't mean that it's homogeneous, it's very heterogeneous, but how do you then find the language that can describe these experiences that is not framed somewhere else?